Greetings. My name is April Athnos, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. I am honored to be one of the recipients this year of the AAEA TLC Graduate Student Teaching Awards. As part of this honor, I've been invited to share some of my teaching tips and experiences in order to share with other graduate students and members of the AAEA community the journey that I've had towards becoming an instructor that I can say I am proud to be. To provide some context for who I am, I'd like to start at the beginning. I hail from a family of many different educators. My paternal grandparents were both English teachers at the high school level. My godmother is an elementary school teacher, and then another one of my aunts was an art history instructor for a while. So I've been around educators my entire life. And my parents would argue that I've also been in school my entire life, but that's another matter. When I started as an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, I actually chose that university and was there to pursue a special education degree. I didn't wind up sticking with special education, but made an extreme pivot to economics, political science, and math. But taking a year's worth of courses in special education was quite formative for me in thinking about how learning happens and how to assess it. Once I began my graduate career at the University of Colorado Boulder, I started out as a TA. This wasn't an entirely new experience because I had supported some of the instructors and professors at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, but this was the first time that I formally ran a classroom as a recitation leader. Once I got my master's degree, I was then allowed to be instructor of record at the University of Colorado, and I taught principles of microeconomics to a relatively large 180 students in the fall of 2015, and then got a unique opportunity to teach a smaller class of roughly 40 in the continuing education department. And that was really different because it wasn't a group of traditional students, but much more non-traditional night school students. Then once I began my PhD program at Michigan State University, I was a research assistant for quite a while and I didn't teach. But I am now finishing up the last of 5 semesters of instruction as the instructor of record for ecological economics. This has by far been my most rewarding experience, and it's also gone through many different iterations. Complete classroom lecture, a hybridization that was imposed by COVID-19 restrictions, and then for the last 3 semesters, entirely online instruction. Over the years, I've been incredibly fortunate to have tremendously impactful mentors through my instruction career. My first recommendation for those who are looking to buff up on their instruction skills is to find your people. There are many different opportunities that I've found here at Michigan State University to develop my skills as an instructor. There's an entire department that's aimed at higher education and adult learning here at MSU, and they have amazing resources helping other instructors in other departments prepare their classes and really target their assessments to be formative and rewarding to students. And frankly, I find that the more that I work with the graduate school, with other educators at MSU that are outside of my department, the more rewarding it is for me too, because I'm learning a lot and gleaning much wisdom from people with more experience than me. One of the really strong mentors that's here at MSU actually has a background in elementary education. And this dovetails really nicely with my history and special education, because a lot of the building blocks of how students started learning in the first place come from an area of empathy, of repetition, and there's more overlap with elementary education and higher education than I think many people would like to admit. So I really recommend getting outside of economics, rubbing shoulders with other educators, even if it seems like they're at a lower level than you, they definitely are not. They have a lot of experience to share. At Michigan State University, we benefit from lots of different workshops and trainings. There are a lot of continuing education opportunities if you're open to them. And I really love the Lunch and Learn program that MSU has offered because it allows graduate teaching assistants and teaching instructors to come together and really do some preparation to retailer their courses or rethink about how the status quo operates. And what I've really found is that by taking the experiences of others and the suggestions of how they design their syllabi, how they form their assessments, how they offer feedback, lots of different components of a course, I have thought ahead, and the investment that I've put in over the summer or during a semester break has paid dividends in terms of decreased workload later, creating more consistent expectations for students, and just relieving the stress and the burden that definitely piles up in the middle of the semester. So I recommend that you find people that can support you and create community with you so that you are designing the best courses you can, and essentially that you're saving yourself time later by gleaning the wisdom of others now. Speaking of saving your time and energy later, I find it critically important to set clear expectations, this benefiting both myself and the students of the courses I instruct. Specifically, before the semester begins, think to yourself about what skills you expect your students to come to your course with and how you will help them if they show up with a little bit less than what you wanted. For example, in ecological economics, there have been many students who took their principles of microeconomic courses 2, 3, 4 years before stepping foot into a course where they needed to use those principles again. In order to combat this, I often reach out to students early on and say, if you think that you're going to have trouble, speak up sooner as opposed to later. And I really encourage students not to feel shameful for forgetting about supply and demand graphs or needing a refresher, but that they should be upfront about it and be clear with the skill set that they have so that we can really equip them for when we dive in head first to using equilibria, using these models for externalities, and really building upon that knowledge base that we would hope showed up on the first day. One thing that I have benefited from during the pandemic in particular is explaining to students how long they should expect to spend doing different components of the course each week. We use D2L at MSU, and I've chosen to use it. And every week, I send an email to students telling them how long they should expect to spend on reading required content, watching videos, listening to podcasts, how long the lecture videos will be, and then kind of how long they should expect to time budget. This allows students to more accurately plan their time, and it prevents kind of curveballs coming from left field, which is good in terms of setting up week to week how much content you're going to put in as an instructor, and then allowing students to adjust their expectations based on that allocation. One thing that I got from some of my mentors at MSU is to feel open and accessible in terms of sharing why you've designed your course the way you did. You're the expert here. You know the background knowledge and you have the expertise to share with your undergraduate or graduate students. And you've made important decisions. Just like if you're writing a research paper, you want to justify why you've made those decisions. Ultimately, students will have better buy-in if they understand that you are really aiming at improving their learning outcomes. So I've frequently faced pushback for there being too many readings or too much content. But by explaining, well, there were 5 different readings because they really touched on 5 individual and very distinct concepts that were part of this overarching theme, it really allows students to understand and cooperate and more actively co-create their learning with you. And then this is something that I have worked on, I'm still working on, and I'm sure in the future even it will change. But setting clear expectations for your hours of availability can be critical to your mental health and also the mental health of your students too. Allowing students to know when you are available, what your communication policy is, and what is appropriate or inappropriate contact is really important. Some instructors are very comfortable allowing students to have phone numbers, to text them, to have an open door tech policy at all times. I'm a little bit more guarded than that. I like to sleep at night. And so I always warn students that if it's after, 9 p.m., I probably won't be getting back in an evening. But first thing in the morning, I will be glad to return an email or any other form of correspondence. So it's also important that once you set your boundaries, you communicate that they are for your health and to maintain respectful boundaries, but also that you have to hold up your end of the bargain too. So I sometimes find myself, if I'm up late, stopping and saying, okay, if you send an email now, this will open the door and say that your boundary is artificial. And so I really do work to ensure that I am putting up my boundaries and then sticking to them as well. So I think that clear expectations can make your life easier, make your students' lives easier, and are worthwhile to straighten out before a semester begins. Throughout the years, I've had many different class sizes, and I've had many different groups of students come through the classroom. This has caused me to ask some really important questions about assessment methods and what my expectations are of students. So I've asked some deep questions of myself, and one of the deepest questions that I've asked that's caused me to reflect, pause, and really kind of back up is, what do you reward? This in particular came up when I had a presentation component to ecological economics, and generational divide clearly happening. Some of the students got up to present in crop tops. And this sort of blew me away because I could never fathom, as someone who dresses up and tries to put forth a very professional aura, that like, oh my goodness, why would somebody wear a crop top to give a presentation? But then I thought about this, and the presentation was amazing, and the students were passionate, and they really strongly communicated the concepts of the course and demonstrated an ownership and a mastership of their learning. And so I absolutely did not penalize those students for wearing what maybe some would consider inappropriate attire, because that was not one of the objectives of the course. So this was really important for me to think about, because I didn't want to penalize or reward something that would be more along the lines of the status quo if my students were clearly demonstrating the learning that the course was designed to capture and facilitate. So there aren't right or wrong answers to this question, but I think that it's something that, whether you've taught for 2 years or 42 years, it's an important question worth asking, and over time it will change. One of the things that I've certainly had to evaluate and work on myself is that I don't just reward students who behave the way I did as an undergraduate. I was a bookworm, always sitting in the first row, always asking questions. That is not the way that everyone learns, and everyone is not as bubbly and outgoing and ooh, pick me as I was. And so I've had to humble myself and realize that there are many different ways of succeeding, and there are many different ways of owning your learning. And this is something that I progress with to this day. And I certainly try to design assessments more now that capture improvement over time and an abandoning of preconceived notions by students who may have had a really hard time dropping some of the frameworks that they used outside the economic framework and adopting that lens through the course that I now teach. And finally, the last tip that I would have for anyone who's teaching, especially as we chart these uncertain times where many of us think we're going to in-person learning again, but there is an opportunity that if the Delta variant becomes more progressive and more pronounced, that we might be doing more online instruction. I think it's important to remember that undergraduates and graduates alike, anyone who's taking a class really wants to form a human connection with their instructor. So I try to practice what I consider radical empathy, which is empathy above and beyond anything I would ever expect anyone to demonstrate for me. I think early on in my instructing career, I was always trying to create an ironclad syllabus. There is no such thing as an ironclad syllabus. This experience with COVID-19 has proven that more than anything, because who knows when a worldwide pandemic is going to strike and the status quo will get flipped upside down and people's families and friends and themselves will come down ill. That requires radical flexibility, and it requires remembering that students have very full lives and many challenges outside of the classroom. So I've been very fortunate at Michigan State University to be afforded a lot of flexibility in terms of helping students get back on track, adapting to the challenges that they've been thrown, things like that. And I really encourage people to take a step back and think, how should I work with this student to help them navigate this problem so that they can still learn? Learning is ultimately the goal. And without acknowledging the human in our students and the human in ourselves, that can be a burden to learning, or a blockade to learning. And so just being empathetic about challenges and honest and open can be really, really important. And I think that this is kind of a response to an existential question for higher education as online learning becomes a larger and larger component of higher education. The question is, well, how much is online education a substitute for in-person education? And I think that whether online or in person, forming a human connection is what's really important. And letting students know that you're there, that you care about them as people and their learning as well is a huge part of this. So I think that I started as a instructor who started kind of hard, and the longer I go on and the more kind of the softer and softer I am getting, because just the more experience I have seeing how tenacious students can be in the face of challenges, I'm just blown away that they are committed to their education, even when family members have died, when they've had mental health conflicts, when truly the worst things have happened to them. So making sure that they can reach their expectations and understanding what those expectations are for those people is critical. I'd like to thank the AAEA Teaching, Learning, and Communications section for allowing me to share my experiences and some of my tips with you today. I know that I am constantly learning as an instructor and hope to glean some of the experiences that you have had from conversations in the future. Don't be a stranger. You can always reach out to me at athnos@msu.edu or hit me up on Twitter at AprilAthnos. And I look forward to having discussions with many of you about teaching in the future.